Hilma Wolitzer says she couldn't bring herself to host a memorial service for her husband of 68 years after his death to COVID-19. She said it took her about a year to have that service virtually by Zoom. Something that helped her was gathering up a collection of stories she'd published throughout the 60s and 70s for a new collection titled Today a Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket. Among the stories in this collection is a brand new one she wrote sometime in September of 2020. The story brings to Hilma Wolitzer fans, incredibly, another story that features the recurring characters of Paulette and Howard, a couple we've come to know over many decades as they manage romance, marriage, parenthood, infidelity, and more in their life together. In the 2020 story, Paulette and Howard have been together for 6 decades. They're still in New York City, and something everyone is calling a pandemic has changed their way of life forever. This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. I spoke to author Hilma Wolitzer about her latest collection of stories, Today a Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket. So for our listeners who've not yet read this collection, how would you describe it to them?
Well, it's a combination. It's a combination of very old stories and one very new story. And some of the stories follow the same characters through their falling in love and marrying and having children. And the final story in the collection takes them to the age of Coda and their old age, which actually reflects my own life more than any of the other stories do. I usually don't write autobiographically, but I did for that final story because both my husband and I contracted COVID and very early on in the pandemic, and he died of it. So I did find myself writing about it. It was both painful and cathartic. But there are other stories in it, too, and I hope that they capture the time that most of them were written. The oldest one is 55 years old, and I hope that they're still relevant today.
Well, so you mentioned here that the stories do date back to the 60s. One was published in the Saturday Evening Post 55 years ago. My sense of things is that these stories won't be read today as, sort of these dated classics or something, but as very relevant and resonant stories, sure, of an earlier time. I mean, no one has a cell phone, but
nobody has a computer. You're right.
Yeah, except in the last story, of course. But what remains are people and their relationships, their fears.
And their inner lives.
Yes.
And I think that women's inner lives haven't really changed that much throughout the centuries, really. And certainly not in 55 years. I think they began to be aware of more things but I felt that they were troubled by certain circumstances in their lives. I, for one, loved being a wife and mother. I loved my domestic years, and I like especially that I could make use of them as fictional material. But I really think that even then, back when I was enjoying making all those Halloween costumes and birthday cakes, I was thinking that I wanted something else, but I didn't know what it was until I began writing.
But there is such a timelessness in the stories that I can really appreciate. I mean, I became a mom in the late 90s, and yet there's so much that I respond to in a story that was first published in the 60s about...
That makes me very happy. Very young early readers at the publishers who were given the collection to read, I guess when they were making a decision about publishing it, the very young readers were very enthusiastic about them. And that so surprised and pleased me that they did have that timelessness for those readers and for you.
Well, and it just reminds me so much about this idea in fiction I love to read nonfiction and creative nonfiction, and we talk about how the truth is stranger than fiction, or the truth is so interesting to read, and creative nonfiction is so interesting for that reason, among many others. But the thing about fiction is that it is the truest truth. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like...
It makes a lot of sense, because Grace Paley, one of my favorite writers, used to tell her writing students, don't make your stories better, make them truer. And I understood that. And it didn't mean factual truth. In some of my stories, there are general truths and there is factual truth, and I think that's how you write fiction. There are universal truths, and I'm very happy when a reader has some shock of recognition. I feel that way too. Or how do you know how I feel? Mm-hmm. Or how did you know how I feel? Which gives me a great deal of pleasure. Just recently, I opened a book of poetry, and a letter fell out. And the letter was from a child. I had written some children's books back in the 80s, and this letter came in the 80s, though it's not dated. And the child said something like, how great it was to be able to write something that makes me feel you know how I feel. It was a wonderful letter. I posted it on my Facebook page, covering the child's last name, because I felt he's now probably a man close to 50 who would like his privacy. Wow. But I was very moved by it, and it's exactly what a writer of fiction wants to have happen.
What a beautiful, beautiful thing to have happen to you.
It was wonderful, and he even had a marvelous postscript. He addressed me as Ms. Wolitzer, and he said, P.S., I didn't know if you were married. I hope you don't mind.
Oh, my gosh. That's so dear.
It was adorable.
That is so precious.
Further embarrassment for this middle-aged man, probably.
Well, and so speaking of making it even truer, I feel like your protagonists, your narrators, your first-person narrators, like Paulette, for instance, who is this recurring character, wife of Howard, they're so... I don't want to get into a discussion necessarily of the reliable or unreliable narrator. I just feel like they are so honest. They're so unfiltered, and not in a negative way, but just in the way that they see the world and that they talk about it, and they're trying to figure things out for themselves as they're telling the story. And as readers, we go along with them, and the mysteries of life are displayed to us, and all we really need to stand in for anything else, there won't be a tidy resolution, but all we really need is the story and the sort of unraveling of these ideas that are laid out before us.
I think that writing those stories gave me an outlet for those feelings. Even when I didn't write directly about my own experience, I think I would have been too shy to say some of the things out loud that I said when I wrote them in those stories. And that reflects the time period as well, when women didn't use certain language. Mm-hmm. I had one story, I won't name the magazines, but the story was taken by a magazine, and it had a word in it that one of the editors, I think it was the editor-in-chief, was objected to, and he changed the word. And then, for some reason, the magazine dropped the story, and another magazine, a smaller, more literary magazine, picked it up and reinserted that word.
Wow.
And I felt really triumphant about it.
Wow, I can imagine that. And so imagine that kind of censoring, right? It's really kind of incredible.
And when you're writing, you don't feel as if there's a censor sitting on your shoulder.
Yes.
You really don't. And I found that my current publishers and magazines that I've published in lately are much more accepting of anything you say, as long as you say it well.
Exactly. Well, Back to Paulette and Howard. I mean, we see them as a young couple dealing with the things that young couples do with children and parenting, jobs, domestic roles, bills, fidelity, and in-laws. When you revisited these stories from decades ago, when you yourself were the ages of those characters, how did you encounter, for example, Paulette and her sense of these kinds of really problematic things that she was going through, right? This a suspicion about her husband with another woman, or that maybe she could have been going through some postpartum depression that made her feel sometimes disconnected, or they're so complex. These characters are so absolutely complex, and that's something that I love about them. It's not just they're flawed like the rest of us, but they are really dealing with complicated issues that, as we were saying, are very difficult for us to be honest about, and yet here they are for us to try to understand.
I think all people are complex,
yes,
actually. And though the stories, as I said, aren't directly about me, of course I have to use my perception of the world in them. I don't have anyone else's except the people I read. But they're also the consideration of the other. So I always think of Paulette and Howard as neighbors who've moved away, but I've always wondered what happened to them. They seem real to me, even though they are fabricated.
They seem very real to me. In fact, when I got to the 2020 story called The Great Escape, I was so struck by this idea of encountering them again in this new way, and also of encountering Anne and Jason, their children, and sort of saying, "Oh, they're still together," you know.
Yeah, it's a surprise, isn't it?
It was a lovely surprise.
Well, as I said, they're really not my husband and me, but my husband and I were married for 68 years. So the experience of being long married, even without that particular history, was very available to me. And the whole business of the pandemic was very real to me because it was happening very terribly in New York as it is now in Texas, I know. Yes. And I'm so sorry to hear that. So in that sense, I used real, actual events, or some of them, and not exactly as they happen, though. Emily Dickinson said, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." And I take that quite seriously.
Oh, I so see that idea in this story. It would seem to me that a lot of what you write about COVID-19 in New York City in this story is based, obviously, on your own lived experiences. But the details, of course, come through maybe because of this slant, so strikingly universal somehow, and something about the pacing of that story that for me rather adds to the pathos of the story, because it seems like it's moving very fast. Things are we're in the Zoom book club, which is a priceless scene in the story. I love that. I just love it.
I had a lot of trouble with Zoom in the beginning. Now that I've mastered Zoom, I feel like a genius, I must say. I don't have a touch screen on my computer, yet I was frantically touching it to unmute myself. And it was insane. And so I had a lot of fun writing that passage about the book club, the Zoom book club.
Perfect. It was but but it really put me in the mind right back to those days where suddenly it was March 13th, March 15th, and everybody was supposed to stay home. Flights were canceled left and right. Nobody could find a mask to wear, or they were just
Exactly.
and you touch on every single one of those emerging issues that we were all sort of shaking our heads about and saying, what in the world? And we had a little bit of information and people warning us, but it was just this intangible thing that we just couldn't. Not
I
that
know
we
it
couldn't.
felt
Yeah.
it felt so urgent,
Yes.
and we still don't know everything,
Right.
which is quite scary. But I think we've made great strides, but there are a lot more to be made.
In some ways, literature, in many ways, obviously, literature and art document periods and situations and major events in our lives. And so I would like to ask you, what will The Great Escape reveal to readers years from now about these particular pandemic experiences? I know we're not post-pandemic. I know we're not. I know we're still very much in this new phase of the pandemic. But what will The Great Escape, do you think, reveal to readers?
Well, I hope it will make people aware of how it was sort of sprung on us and how we were foolishly living our ordinary lives and how long it took us to really understand how serious it was and how it altered one's daily existence. When my husband came down with COVID first, he was so disabled he couldn't even stand up, and I had to call 911, and somebody came, and as in the story, they took him off, and I never even had a chance to say goodbye to him. And a few days later, I began to cough and was home. So I was home for about 8 days when my fever spiked, and I had to call an ambulance for myself. And then he died 2 days before I came home. So this was such an unusual time in my own experience. I'm 91 years old, and I don't remember. And I lived through the Depression and World War II and a lot of major issues in the country, but I don't remember feeling so altered personally by any experience as I do by this. It changed the way we deal with friends and relatives. My children couldn't visit my husband in the hospital. Nobody saw him off. Nobody was able to come to see me. There were no, and even though I never really believed that the rituals of mourning really mattered, they do. And being deprived of them was very, very difficult. Not being able to sit with the people you love and hold one another and comfort one another was really quite wrenching. And it took me a whole year, a year to the day of my husband's death, to do a memorial service for him. And, of course, it was a Zoom memorial service, and I was able to get it right this time. And many, many friends and relatives came. And oddly enough, even though I was skeptical, I felt very consoled by it. And I felt writing the story somewhat consoling at the same time that it was heartbreaking to write.
I'm so sorry about your loss and everything you went through. And, we would read about these ways that our loved ones were in the hospital and people couldn't say goodbye except through a cell phone that the nurse was holding up to the patient, and these sorts of nightmarish things that I'm considering right now, that after almost 70 years of being together,
Yes, and I have to say that in your 90s, you know that one of you is going to die in the near future. Yeah. And this is something we talked about and tried to accept and tried to joke about when we could. But it was the circumstances of this, the vanishing, rather than rather than somebody dying with loved ones around them, all the obituaries that you read that always said died peacefully surrounded by family. Mm-hmm. I don't know how he died. I wasn't there. And I never got to speak to whoever was there, if anyone really was at that moment of death. So I really don't know. So I try not to focus on that. I try to focus mm-hmm. on the happy years, mm-hmm. The children, the grandchildren, mm-hmm. the wonderful bonuses of marriage.
Yes. Well, in her foreword, Elizabeth Strout says to start with the story called Nights, if we have ever suffered from insomnia. And frankly, I do.
Me too.
Given to this. And Paulette too, I think. And other characters, I think they're just so wakeful. They're so wakeful and they're so...
That's a wonderful word.
Yeah. And I feel like maybe it's been exacerbated because of the pandemic. I'm not sure. But the story doesn't necessarily make you understand insomnia any better. But as Elizabeth Strout says, it will make you understand that you are not alone in the world. And that's what literature does. So, but for me, I find that the short story is a form that accomplishes this in ways that are different than novels, than even your novels do. Not better, not worse, but just in a very different way.
Yes, I agree. I do agree.
They somehow help us understand, maybe because of the economy of the space, we feel like we can know each other maybe in a more immediate way about a specific thing, even an unsayable thing that remains mysterious to us, but we somehow feel like we have it in common. And I really see this quality in this collection. Story after story, where it's this resonance, this mystery of life that's sort of sprung open for us to examine and recognize suddenly that is some aspect from our own lives. And your stories are in first-person point of view, and I find your narrators... I'm just going to say that, go back to this idea about unreliability and reliability. I find them wholly reliable. But
oh, thank you. That's a great compliment.
I really do. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your choice to write in the first person.
Well, I don't always write in the first person, but when I do, I feel more connected because I begin writing sometimes when you give a reading and people will ask in the Q&A, where do you get your ideas? And I realize I don't get ideas. I get characters, and my characters tell me their story. And most often they would start with a single sentence, and most often in the first person, as if somebody has sat down next to me and said, let me tell you about my life.
I just totally see that. And that takes me to the title story. Today, a woman went mad in the supermarket.
Quite a title, right?
I love it.
It was so long, I was afraid it wouldn't fit on the dust jacket, along with my mouthful of a name.
Oh, no, it's kind of perfect. That story, I mean, from the outset, this is exactly what you've just described. This character is telling you the story. I mean, even a character that's not able to articulate, as we see with this poor woman with the empty purse and these children in the supermarket, isn't able to articulate the story. But the narrator is telling us all we really need to know.
Yeah, people ask me about the title. What do I mean by the title? And of course, there's a literal meaning. A woman actually has a nervous breakdown in a supermarket. But then there's a metaphorical meaning. I think it reflects a lot about the turmoil that some women felt during that particular period of time. This was on the cusp of the second wave of feminism. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it just reflects that. And the supermarket seemed like an ideal setting because it's so full of all that domestic bounty. And women were thinking about their domestic lives. which I will never give short shrift to, since mine was not only pleasing, but as I said, gave me an awful lot of literary material.
Well, and these women are so industrious. They're so resourceful. They're always thinking. I just love these characters. And again, there's that time. That's part of what makes it so timeless and makes these characters so memorable. And I wonder too if you would consider bringing Paulette back in, some 2021 stories. That's a book I really would love to read.
That's a wonderful idea. I have to say, my writing daughter, I have two wonderful daughters, and my writing daughter, Meg, suggested that I write a book about a character, the mother-in-law in the book, in the story, in the final story, who goes on to become the Merry Widow of Boca Raton.
Oh, yes.
And Meg liked that so much, she wanted that to be the title of my next book. And I actually began writing it. But it could include her daughter-in-law, Paulette, who comes to visit her in Florida.
Oh, I would love to be privy to those scenes between those two women. I would love that.
Oh, to have readers before you've written. That's a writer's dream.
Well, Hilma Wolitzer, I cannot thank you enough. What an honor and a thrill to get to talk to you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hilma Wolitzer is the author of the story collection, Today a Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.